Erev Tov, everybody. Great to be together. We are on to a new Chumash Shemot, and on to a new companion, a new teacher, Rabbi Avital Hachstein. For something approaching 10 years, Mechon Hadar has had a weekly Dvar Torah emailed out. There's audio files. Some of them are in Hebrew and in English from one of their faculty, uh, writing on the weekly Parsha over the course of the year. And they're all outstanding, and any of them would be amazing to journey through the year. This year, Rabbi Tali Adler is writing the weekly Divrei Torah, and they are, I think, phenomenal. Um, so I hope this will be the first of maybe a number of different opportunities we will have to glean from the Hadar faculty and their writings. Um, I believe that we've done one or two different Chumashim with Rabbi Shai Held in his book Heart of Torah. I believe that some of those, were originally his weekly Parsha Divrei Torah for Hadar. So these things take on a life of their own. And I've always appreciated Rabbi Avital Hachstein's kind of ability to zoom out and kind of look at the bigger thematic, psychological picture. Um, James, I'll come to your question in a moment. Great question. Thematic, psychological picture, a kind of political level reading of the text. Midrash and Chazal is her area of focus. She did her PhD, I believe, in Talmud on a chapter of Masechet Sanhedrin, has written a lot on Midrash. And she frequently incorporates, a midrash as a central part of her analysis. Um, and I think, given how much Chumash Shemot is its own in its own way, a kind of a meta level book, the narratives are giving us a chance to understand the birth and development of the Jewish people as a nation. It's a nice opportunity to kind of look into her thought, which I think is well matched in particular for a Chumash like Shemot. She currently serves as the president of Machon Hadar in Israel, and so the time zone will not work simply. But I do plan to reach out and let her know that we are reading her Divrei Torah, and I imagine if we wind up collecting some questions or thoughts, we may be able to send them her way. Um, she's a wonderful teacher and a wonderful person. Um, Debbie sounds like was having a little visual difficulty. Um, Hopefully others can see me. So I think it may be a question of just if you're on an iPad or iPhone, kind of swiping in one direction or another. If you're on a laptop or something like that, maybe just rearranging your window. Um, Hopefully one of those things will work. And if it makes the most sense to just log out and log back in, maybe that'll help as well. Um, so okay, in terms of kind of length and style, I assume, although I don't know for sure, that these were written originally in Hebrew and then translated into English. Um, but and I don't know whether she did the translations. My sense is that she did. She's incredibly, well written in Hebrew and in English. Um, but I don't know for sure kind of what the order of the languages of the writing is. And these are, tend to be not very long, a good bit longer than the average Rav Bazak comment, but shorter than, the some of the Rav Meidans, certainly than the Rav Elchanan Samitz, more on the length of the Rav Shai pieces that we've seen. And It'll be fun to delve into them and see. I think they'll hopefully generate some good discussion. Um, and there's only one on each parsha, so we'll be looking at her essay for each week. And again, these were written in 57, 77, so we're talking about 8 years ago. I think the one that we're looking at this week certainly um, deals with themes that feel very live today. Um, so without further ado. This essay is called A Slippery Slope from Fear to Evil. The first chapter of Sefer Shemot contains an important lesson for society. Evil can be perpetrated more easily by a group than by an individual. The chapter, meaning chapter 1, Perek Aleph of Shemot, sounds this warning. The evil of a decree doesn't keep people from obeying it. To the contrary, a blanket permission to be evil is a lot easier to implement than one single point of evil. Moreover, an all-encompassing license is, by its very nature, difficult to control once it is released. On top of that, it often returns to visit itself on the people who unleashed it. I think we're going to see, as we read through and get familiar with her style, this is kind of starting with sharing a kind of a theme or a broad view, developing it by reading through the psukim and introducing a midrash that develops it further, which may have been the motivation for the whole reading, altogether. It's kind of the style. We'll see, I think, a little bit less of a turn to the classical medieval commentaries, that Rav Bazak often started with relating to, Rav Meidan often started with relating to, and more of just kind of letting the text speak for itself, um, and and often with a midrashic comment. Chapter 1 opens by listing the names of the people who came down to Egypt. No groups or tribes, no numbers, initially just names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, etc. These are the opening two psukim of the book of Shemot. However, as the chapter proceeds, we see a shift in the way that the Israelites are described. At first listed individually and by name, but soon Bnei Israel become like a swarm and subsumed by the group identity. The individual unique characteristics become general, their attributes consumed by the group identity. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. Um, James, you were asking about, does it say 70? Let's go and check that.
Yeah, she says no numbers, but I'm pretty sure it says seven. Yeah, right
Yes,
there.
yes. After the names, right? So how does she write it here? No groups, no numbers. Initially, just names. So it's a little bit. You're right. It's a little bit kind of a weak, um, differentiation because the number follows immediately after the list of names.
I
Uh,
think she's comparing it to the beginning of Bamidbar, where there is all the names, all the numbers, and there's a count.
Yeah,
Here,
but there you're dealing with thousands of people. Here you're dealing with
right,
70.
I
right.
know, but here the feeling I get is she's that they're listed as individuals. That's what she's trying to say, and then we go from individuals to a group. That's, I think, the point she's trying to make.
I'm just looking back at to see how it varies from the end of Breshit, where we have the accounting of going down. These are the names of the Israelites, and we just get the list of names. Um, I guess there we, as grouped by family, we get the numbers after each family grouping, and then we end, with the total number being 70. It doesn't feel materially different um, than here. I guess one could argue that, and it's a small point in one sense, but still, I the goal here is to do a close reading of the commentary that we're looking at. So it's a small point in one sense. Um, you could argue that verses 1 through 4 are their own kind of unit. These are the names of the sons of Israel, and we get their names. That's kind of story number one. And then we have a kind of a separate, um, by the way, they came with, after you add them all up with their households, it comes to 70. But there's kind of like a strong division between verse 4 and verse 5, but that's not apparent in the text. So I think it's a good pushback from James. Um, when it says no groups or tribes, no numbers, initially just names, but the number follows so quickly after the names. And I agree with Debbie as well. Obviously, it is very different than a census, but there already the numbers are much bigger, as James said. Okay. So again, now the distinction that she's going to make is weakened a little bit by this point. But however, as the chapter proceeds, we see a shift in the way that the Israelites are described. At first listed individually and by name, but soon Bnei Israel become like a swarm and subsumed by the group identity. The individual unique characteristics become general, their attributes consumed by the group identity. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. Already here in verse 7. And it's interesting that the classic, or kind of the general translation of this vav is but. I don't know exactly what we're meant to read from that, but I guess it's contrasting that generation died, but that was not the end of the Israelites. They actually moved from a small group to an enormous group and filled the land. This shift in how Bnei Israel are described is also a foreshadowing of the disintegration of the Israelites' relationship with the Egyptians. As Bnei Israel grow in numbers, they are treated with more alienation. A new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Yosef. That's the next pasuk. With alienation and foreignness come fear, stereotypes, generalizations, and imaginations of danger and war. As it continues, and Paro said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. And just to note, sometimes we've asked this with Rabbi Zaken of what's the chiddush here, right? There's not a new or novel reading, but what I think she's teaching us to do, some of us may do this kind of intuitively or automatically, sort of teaching us to, not just accept the narrative details as they're being presented to us. There's not just sort of say like, okay, we know the story, so we're hearing the story again. Yes, we're being reminded what is the plot line, but sort of say, why is the story being told this way, and what is the message of kind of this development, and just to really just in a sense, almost by summarizing, kind of draw out the message of the text. And her point here is Bnei Israel undergo a change in the way the text describes them, changes from individuals to a undifferentiated mass. That's kind of internal to the what's being told about Bnei Israel as a people, irrespective of anybody else. But then also it provokes change in the way the Egyptians view them. It's also worth just pausing to say about this passage. Let me share my screen again. And Dr. Devorah Steinmetz, in a class she gave a number of months ago, points this out, that this language, bears lots of similarity, in particular verse 7, pru orvu, shirtzu, batimale haaretz. These are all, Breshit Perek Aleph terms. These are all Genesis chapter 1 terms. So, one kind of framework for this is, the individual and the national. And another way she tries to talk about it is kind of, I don't have this sharp enough to really do it justice, but that in the Breshit story, kind of God is there to sort of make order out of the chaos. And here it's much more initially, at least in the personal realm, in the human realm, there's sort of this chaos, and what comes in to make order out of the chaos, are kind of the questions that we are dealing with in the beginning of Shemot, that are parallel to Breshit, but different. So there's a lot to unpack on just the way Shemot begins, comparing it to the way Breshit begins on its own. But here we're.
I think you can
please.
also say that was the creation of the world,
and
this is the creation of Am Yisrael.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Along with, or perhaps on account of, this growing sense of alienation and paranoia, come attempts to create boundaries and distinctions. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Paro, Pitom, and Ramses. Clearly, these differentiating limitations and restrictions are not of the separate but equal kind, if that is at all possible. Rather, they are designed to be a type of harmful discrimination. And again, sometimes it's hard to get out of our own framework, either just because we're so used to the story, or even because, we're familiar with the fact that in the covenant between the parts, back in Genesis chapter 15, God tells Abraham in some sense that this is what's going to happen to his descendants. So we just kind of take it. And what she's just saying to us here is, stop and look at a society that has some group that has entered into it 1 or 2 generations earlier, and now has undergone a change. How is that subgroup itself, that minority group itself, being impacted by the change? And what are the possible reactions that the majority society could have towards that growing group? And what are the crossroads moments where the leader makes a decision about how to treat that minority group, and what provokes or promotes the kinds of decisions that get made. So try to generalize this out of our story, and think about the intergroup relations, the emotional psychological responses that are being depicted here. The description of a very rough attitude towards those who are thought of as other and as threats becomes even worse. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites. So the present chapter emphasizes that foreignness, alienation, and lack of recognition can lead to fear. And fear, that's Paro's initial response, um, is a response of fear. And fear can lead to discrimination and harsh treatment. These opening verses introduce us to Paro's fear, and the way in which that fear is inextricably tied to and is the root of his evil actions, by placing Paro's fear and his cruelty side by side. This structure testifies to a general human tendency. Fear is likely to cause, to incite, to be a means through which one can justify evil. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them with harsh labor and mortar and bricks, and with all sort of tasks in the field. Now, just worth saying, the word fear doesn't appear anywhere in Paro's. We'll see it does appear shortly, but it doesn't appear in Paro's own. The narrator never says Paro was afraid. It just begins with the new king who arose who did not know Yosef, and says, "Look at this people which is too numerous. We have to deal with them shrewdly." Essential to her reading is the idea that this is driven by fear. Um, you know, I don't know if it's possible to read it differently, that it's just a political calculation, about how you manage a subgroup. I don't know if it's possible to sort of say a group that poses a threat without somehow saying fear, or if really it just reduces to the same thing. Um, but without, her reading is this is driven by fear based on Paro, the concern that Paro articulates in his first words, um, and that leads to the evil. Not only this, but the evil that comes from fear has a tendency to be extreme. So, in the eye of the fearful beholder, even someone who is not threatening can wear Satan's mask. Even someone who is totally helpless can seem monstrous and destructing. He can be perceived as the cause of extreme danger so long as he is part of the group being feared. And we can imagine where this is leading, and how she's leading because of having read through the whole chapter and now anticipating what's coming next. This is how we find ourselves moved, as if it were completely natural and inevitable, to the next stage of the story, where the king of Egypt goes so far as to command the murder of day-old children. Right, and again, without I mean, I am overemphasizing it, but we just know this story, so we kind of do take it, as completely natural and inevitable. And she's sort of saying, slow down. Like, how did you jump from forced labor and, backbreaking work, which is terrible in its own right, and we have to ask how we got there. But how do we jump from there to killing babies? The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Let's just catch up, right? So the only little interjection that she didn't comment on here was the response that the Bnei Israel responded with growth despite or somehow in response to their oppression. The labor, is ruthless and persistent, and now we immediately jump to this death sentence. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shifra and the other Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. By the way, Hebrew midwives is, as we may know, one of two interpretations. The text calls them the Mialdot HaIvriot, and it's possible that they were the Hebrew midwives, as is translated here, and it's also possible that they were the midwives of the Hebrews, and that they could have been Egyptians. I think we may have seen a Rav Shai held on that question. I can't remember for sure. But this is, I believe, the JPS's translation. When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. Evil that operates through fear is very hard to stop, in part because it's hard to recognize that evil for what it is, because you see it as somehow justified through the lens of fear. It presents itself as justified, even when it is actually extreme and absurd. There's something that inspired the midwives to behave differently. They remain aware of what truth and what righteousness are. They fear God instead of fearing Paro, instead of fearing what Paro himself fears. Right? So just a nice reading. Again, as we pointed out, the Paro's fear is never made explicit with the words, and Paro was afraid of the Israelites. But that is, I think, again, a fair underlying reading of what's going on for Paro, and therefore it lays the groundwork for the significance of the midwives fearing God that we're about to see, because they make two different choices: not to be afraid of Paro like everybody else, and also not to be afraid of what's driving Paro's evil, which is his fear. It seems like these midwives can break through the clouds of panic and fear that surround them and shine a light on what it means to recognize the other, to be responsible, and to behave justly. The midwives feared God. We don't exactly know what divine conditions moved the midwives. The verses are not specific and don't fully address the question of what constitutes fear of God for them. However, what the verses do make clear is that this fear of God is what brought them to choose differently. They did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live, right? So immediately after Paro's, uh, you know, instruction and command to kill the baby boys, Vatirena hamiladot et Elohim, the midwives fearing God, lo asu kasher diber alehen melech Mitzrayim, they didn't do what the king of Egypt told them, vatechayena et hayeladim. Last year on Parshat Zachor, where it talks about velo yarei Elohim as a feature of Amalek, I tried to make the argument that in the places where Yirat Elohim comes up in the Chumash, it's typically associated with kind of bucking a trend, and in particular, like ensuring or protecting life as kind of the key symbol or key expression of fearing God. We had it a few weeks ago when Yosef reverses his plan for the brothers and decides, rather than keeping all of them in jail and sending only one to get Shimon, he's just going to get Binyamin rather, he's just going to keep Shimon in jail and send the rest of them to get Binyamin. And he introduces that by saying, Eta Elohim ani yarei, I fear God. And I argue there that he was saying, I know that if I leave you all here in jail, you might starve, and your father up in Egypt will not get food and he could starve. And because I fear God, meaning I don't want people to die. I'm going to just leave Shimon here and send you back with provisions for your father and to come down with your other brother. So this notion of fearing God as being about, preserving life, we see very explicitly here as well. Yes, Bracha, right. It would also make sense that Paro's fear would not be allowed to be visible due to his position of power, right? So maybe there's sort of a subtle, the text hides it. The text, in his behavior, we can surmise and see that he's driven by fear, but the text doesn't say, and Paro was afraid almost because that couldn't, as a reflection of the fact that that couldn't be said aloud. Paro couldn't show fear or vulnerability. It could only show kind of power and control through his response. But we, the
Yeah.
readers, can see through that and see that that's actually driven by
So
fear.
it's like not saying it proves that it's so.
Mm-hmm. Great, great. Thank you. Thank you for raising that. I think it's a nice, again, because so much of her reading hinges on this relationship between the fears, the fear, what you fear. I think pointing out, defending why it's makes sense that Paro's fear is not, articulated directly, is a good, important reading. Yes, when Avram goes to Avimelech, and also there's sort of an irony that it's used also when at the end of the Akedah when God says, you didn't withhold your son from me. So there it's kind of you need a little more complex read because the fact that Avram was willing to sacrifice his son as is a sign of fearing God, slightly cuts in a different direction, but I addressed that in that sermon as well. But yes, there's a couple of important places where this comes up, which is worth a study in its own right. Okay, circling back. Okay, so yeah, so the text is very terse with us, and when you look at a society and you see those who are willing to buck the trend and willing to behave in kind of a civil disobedience and even at great risk, you want to ask what are the conditions, what are the qualities that make that possible, and the text doesn't tell us. It leaves it mysterious. What is it that moves? So writes here, what divine conditions move the midwives to this behavior is not addressed for us. The plans of the king of Egypt have been waylaid, and perhaps out of a blinding fear, he reached out to all of his people, not just the specialized class of birthing professionals. Now every single Egyptian will be involved, and the summons to evil is absolute and all-encompassing. Then Paro charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Right. So we move to Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim Lamiladot Ivriot, speaking to those midwives, and then Vaitzav Paro Lechol Amo Lemor Kol Ben Hayilod Hayaora Tashlichuhu V'Chol Abat Techayun. First, it's a movement from speech, from Vayomer to Vayetzav, charging. So again, a sort of a more exercise of authority, power, and control, moving to a position of command, demand, and also expanding it out to all people, recruiting everybody into this destructive practice. Implementation moves from the individuals in the private realm, the midwives, to the entire society at large, functioning in the public sphere. Now we get the Midrash, which very eye-opening. The following Midrash, with its characteristic sensitivity, is aware of the fact that the object of the evil plan is not well defined in the verse. Quite the opposite, it is described in a very general sense. Every boy, right? The pasuk says, "Kol haben hayilod, hayaora tashlichuhu." Every boy, as opposed to before, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. Now all of a sudden, Paro is just telling the Egyptians, throw every boy into the Nile. That's very general. It is perhaps out of this sensitivity, meaning this sensitivity to the vagueness or global general language of the text about every boy, that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina outlines the gradual development of Paro's plan in 3 stages. So Gemara and Sota, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina Shalosh Gzerot Gazar. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said, Paro enacted 3 decrees. Batchila im ben hu v'hamitenoto. First, the direction to the midwives. If it's a boy, kill him. Ulevasof kol haben hayilod hayaora tashlichuhu. Then every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile. Ulevasof, and at the very end, af al amo gazar. Finally, he even decreed about his own people. Kol haben hayilod hayaora tashlichuhu. That seems to be the second and final. But the something about it being so general moves Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina to suggest that actually this went beyond the Hebrews to the Egyptians themselves, as she's going to now explain. This midrash raises an almost unbelievable possibility, one that would not come to mind were it not written and stated directly. This is, I'm sorry I don't have the Hebrew in front of me. This is a classic rabbinic statement that she's either directly quoting or kind of paraphrasing. The Talmud will sometimes say this, Il malei mikra katuv efshar le'omro. If this verse were not written, it would be impossible to say such a thing. Like the Torah itself is so astonishing. I could never say this myself, but the Torah says it. Right? So she's sort of saying the same thing about this midrash. If this midrash didn't say this, you would never fathom such a thing. But the midrash says it. At the first stage, Paro commanded the midwives to kill all the male children among the Israelites, as per the straightforward reading of the verses. After that, the king of Egypt commanded all of his subjects to kill all of the Israelite male children. But in the third stage, Paro's decree becomes all boys, meaning that he commanded the massacre of all male children, including those among his own people. What the Midrash says is quite simple. Evil is a destructive phenomenon. It has no boundaries and no restrictions, and once it is unleashed, the havoc it wreaks is not bound by reason, and it won't be stopped by any obstacle. Maybe another way of saying this is something that Rav Avi quotes sometimes, the rabbinic saying, Sin'a mekalkelet et hashura. Hate defies the rule, which the sages also say about love. Ahava mekalkelet et hashura. Love defies the rule, that you become blinded by love and blinded by hate, and that causes you to behave in ways that don't map onto order or reason, right? And here this is exactly an example. It's not bound by reason, and it becomes a blinding hatred which no longer even is able to notice distinctions between peoples in a negative sense, almost, and leads to this self-destruction. Chapter 1 of the book of Shemot shows us how easy it is for fear to blind, how swift is the move from fear to evil and debasement, how steep the decline is from panic to an evil that has no logic and sustains no meaning. The opening of the book of Shemot is a warning sign stating that evil prevents you from thinking straight. So much so that even when evil has a specific direction in which it is heading, it can easily forget its target and hit anything and everything in its path, even innocent children, the Egyptians' own. Before we get to the end, I'll just point out where she's going by being so general, I think is what feels to me like a sort of unique dimension of the reading here, which is that, many in the Bait and other places, many shiurim about like the origins of anti-Semitism, and are given based on the opening chapter of Shemot. And she's not denying or taking away from that. She's only generalizing it to say, anti-Semitism is a very particular kind of hate, but it doesn't necessarily behave fundamentally differently than other kinds of hate might behave. And therefore, it behooves us both to recognize the specific phenomenon and also to think about the general phenomenon, as she concludes. We can hear the opening of Shemot as a warning. Even when evil seems justified, it is not right. May we find ways to stop the evil around us, even when we find ourselves in times of great fear. And may we find within ourselves, something of the midwives' power. And if we aren't quite able to be them, let us know to listen to the voices of those in our society who behave like them, and may fear not silence, capitulate, or paralyze us. Again, just the closing moves out from just the hatred of the Israelites, which sort of allows us to preserve victim mentality, and asks us to consider hate as a general phenomenon that we might also fall prey to, and how to kind of notice it. And I think she says something really interesting when she says, even when evil seems justified, it is not right. How do we make sort of that differentiation between justified and right, um, and recognize evil? I think that's even the first question. How do we can we always recognize it? Um, and then how do we act against it? And then I think I also appreciate that last sort of sentence, which says, okay, we might not have the courage to be the midwives. It might come at too great a risk to us. And even if the right thing to do is to be like the midwives, it's just not always possible. And if we can't do that, we don't have to necessarily, therefore, just kind of retreat and do nothing. We can kind of choose whose voices we heed and try to help, lift up or focus on the voices of those who are behaving like the midwives, even if we can't be the midwives ourselves for whatever reason it might be. Thoughts or reactions about this essay? Again, just to circle back for a moment to appreciate kind of what she's doing here. There's nothing, you know, no novel new read of chapter 1 of Exodus, I don't think. It's just a slow digesting of the steps and a kind of unpacking, um, taking away our preconceived notions and allowing us to take a fresh look and just say, how does it escalate so quickly to these horrific stages? What does that teach us? And then the Midrash, which clearly I think her reading is right, is about the rabbis sort of saying, not that Paro was a foolish buffoon who lost sight of things and accidentally harmed his own people, but just that this is um, what hatred and destruction often can do. In Jeremiah, our Thursday Jeremiah class, we were reading in the chapter 40, 41, 42 about the fall of Judea, and Yishmael ben Netanya, who comes and assassinates Gedaliah. And after that, it sort of says he goes on and assassinates a bunch of the people that were there. And then he kills some Babylonians. And then he kills the people who were coming on the path. He was afraid that they were going to find out. And again, it's a similar type of almost caricature of someone who, you know, was driven by whatever his motivation was to make his first assassination, and then he gets caught, and not to make him a sympathetic character, but he's caught in this trap then of needing, out of fear of reprisal or getting punished, he starts to have to do more and more blind violence and harm. It may be actually a more warranted fear, but even still, he's being driven by fear, and he can't kind of break out of that pattern. Lance, and then we'll see who else wants to share. Go ahead.
The first thing I would like to do is I'd like to ask you where the arrow is in your name.
Say it again. Where?
Where is the arrow in your name?
The arrow.
Yeah, there's an arrow in your name. You didn't know that? Look at EX.
Oh yeah, like in FedEx.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay. The arrow's pointing to the L.
Right. But the arrow is a natural perspective that is and is not.
Yeah.
Right? Where are all the boys in the Torah? I don't see it.
What do you
see
mean?
it? Well, this whole argument about the Pharaoh said to kill his own male
Yes. Okay.
children. Where is that?
Yeah, so when it says Vayitzav Paro l'chol hamo lemor, Paro charged all his people, saying, Kol haben hayilod, every boy that is born, throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. The question is, every what boy? He doesn't say every Hebrew boy. And when he was talking to the Hebrew midwives or the midwives of the Hebrews, and he said every boy, well, but he was addressing a population that was serving Hebrew boys or Hebrew birthing mothers. So their only group was Hebrew boys. But now he just turns to every Egyptian. If you were an Egyptian and you woke up one morning and there was a message under your doorstep that says Pharaoh hereby decrees that you kill every boy, how would you know that that was referring to Hebrew boys only, to Israelite boys only? So, contextually, of course, the plain sense is presumably that that's what it is, because of the context. But the reading is a fair reading, that it just never says that we've moved beyond those who are servicing the Hebrews. We're talking to all Egyptians, and we're saying kill every boy.
But the language of the Torah is not precise, right? I mean, in Eric Auerbach in Mimesis points out that there's a tremendous difference between Genesis and Homer, the Iliad, because in the Iliad there are all kinds of details. Everything is detailed. You know exactly where everything is. But as Auerbach points out, in Genesis, you don't. Where is God? Where is Abraham? You don't know where they are. There are no details here. You know details in this, right?
Yeah.
So the Midrash is a rabbi who's looking into this and is doing what I would call, what Maurice Merleau-Ponty calls, high altitude thinking. It's thinking from a position outside the text, somewhere in the clouds, that this is the case. And I'm not saying that I know what was going on. I'm not saying that I can challenge what you just said. What you just said makes perfect sense. That Pharaoh says kill all the kids, all the boys. We're pretty sure that the Nazis killed 1.5 million children because they were scared to death that those children were going to come back and kill them. Right? That was a logical reason to do it. I don't see any logical reason here.
Right. Right. Yeah. Great comments and points. Thank you. I don't have more to add at the moment. Other thoughts, reactions?
I had always had difficulty with that midrash about, and I had asked myself all these years, how could the Egyptians have killed their own children? And then I was reading about it just today, and I don't remember where I read it, but the comparison was made that there are all these groups that send out their children with the vests to kill, the suicide vests that don't think twice about using their children and killing them. And that in addition and then I was thinking that at that time, child sacrifice was also not so unheard of. So that if the Pharaoh indeed said, just today, this one day, because of what his astrologers had told him, that he needed to get rid of the male children that day, it's very possible that his people would have agreed to it. And that's how I, understood it for the first time.
Yep. And James writes, if death is venerated, then it makes sense for that to be an honor for children. Yeah. Okay. James, do you want to comment aloud?
Yeah. I just feel like maybe I'm sensitive to this, but it feels like she's warning against the first Trump administration.
Say more.
If I'm calculating the timing, it was 8 years ago, right when the first Trump administration was starting. And it reminds me of some of the themes about division in society, minorities, fear, anger.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very plausible background and context. Not, a very good potential reading. I don't we have to go back to the calendar and see precisely, but it seems to me basically that what you're saying makes sense with what she could have been responding to, indirectly, but maybe obvious. Maybe it was obvious to every reader at that moment 8 years ago. Not sure. Yeah,
Right.
very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, putting it in its historical moment 8 years ago. Yeah, yeah. Other thoughts? Bracha, please.
Yeah, I put it in the chat that it's not logical proves the point.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Because spell it out for us another sentence.
I don't know if I can. It's just that her whole sense of this is that it's all coming out of fear, and that when you're obsessed with fear, it can take you out of reality.
Yeah, yeah. It has its own logic to the person who's engaged in it, but to the midwife, or the clear-eyed viewer who's not gripped by the fear, then the, illogic is apparent. Yeah, great. Lance, back to you for a last word.
What is the 10th plague?
Death of the firstborn.
Of who's firstborn?
The Egyptian firstborn.
Right. Were the Egyptians happy about that? Did they feel that was a good thing?
No.
No. No. So God, God is doing what you're saying Pharaoh wanted to do. And Pharaoh, the same Pharaoh, I guess, is the same Pharaoh, right? Or maybe it's, but it's same type of Pharaoh, is saying this is horrible. Okay, get out. You guys get out. I can't take your God anymore. You're killing my kids. It's terrible. So if it's terrible then, how come it's not terrible now? See what I'm saying? If you're going to be consistent about these things, then let's be consistent. I mean, it makes no sense. But from another perspective, there are a lot of parallels between the story of Joseph and the story of Moses. And in a sense, the plot demands that Moses be saved. So you have the midwives and you have the teva, and you have all these things that, just like you have you sell Joseph into Egypt, slavery in Egypt, and as opposed to killing him, you kill him in a pit, boom, that's it, end of story, ball game over, man, right? You got it. It's the plot. You said in the beginning, it's not the plot. It is the plot, in my view, anyway. That's the key. The plot's the key, because you have to get from here to there, and if you can't get there, then you're screwed. You messed up. We must get to the promised land. We have to get to the promised land. There's no question about it. It's an upward arc. We got to get to Egypt from Abraham. We got to get to Egypt, or even from Adam and Eve. We got to get to Egypt, and then from Egypt we got to get to the promised land, back again, if you want to call it that. You got to do it. It's in there. That's what it is. But the details and how you do it and all that stuff, I don't think anybody in the original audience really cared about any of this the way you guys do. The way I do too. I'm just as guilty as you are. I do high altitude thinking all the time, but I don't. I think I'm wrong.
Fair. Let me take a moment just to attempt, something in between a fair reading and apologetics for the, plague of the firstborn, which is obviously difficult to, killing of people is always difficult to tolerate, and we have to ask, was it warranted? I guess I'm not sure I can sufficiently answer that question, but I do think it's important to point out what seemed to me to be the distinctions, which is what we learn in this chapter is the Jewish people did nothing wrong. They just grew in number. And then they were oppressed and treated ruthlessly, and all they did was just keep growing in number. We don't have any indication that they did anything that on moral scales qualifies as harm to the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians' treatment of them is completely unwarranted and is evil. And then they rise up with their leader and ask to be freed and let go. They demand their human rights, their civil rights, and those things are denied them. And they then, through the agency of God, or so would say, I won't even say them through the agency of God, God then, on their behalf, resorts to more and more intensive measures to attempt to free and enslave people. Now, we can always ask the question, when does it cross some line of being unwarranted and the ends don't justify the means? I think that's the question I guess I ask myself as a reader of the 10 plagues. How do we make that evaluation? But again, I think it's still worlds apart between the unwarranted violence that's driven by fear and is not a response to any moral wrong, which is what Paro and the Egyptians are perpetrating, and God's use of force when other means have been exhausted to free God's people. So that's the differentiation I would make. Again, it's not ironclad. I think that the distinction is ironclad. Whether that ultimately, through our eyes, justifies the extent of the 10 plagues is a question. I'll also just point out, that to the question of the differentiations, it's actually not even totally clear that it didn't wind up including Israelites, right? Those who did not place blood on their doorposts, I'm not sure they were protected when the destroyer passed through Egypt. So there is a kind of an ironic sort of parallel, and I wonder whether this midrash is in any way relating to it. That when it came to the death of firstborns, Israelites who were not participating in the covenant or the commitment may also not have been spared, and God might have wound up killing God's own firstborn, so to speak, to use the language that's in Exodus chapter 4, when God says, Israel is my firstborn, and tell Paro, let my son go, that he may worship me, and you refuse, and therefore I'm going to kill your firstborn. But it may wind up actually backfiring onto some of God's own Israelite firstborn. And that's, I think, an interesting parallel to reflect on more. So thanks for letting me get the last word on this one. And thank you to everybody. Lot to unpack, a lot to think about as we read through Exodus chapter 1 this coming Shabbat. And we're on our way with Rabbi Avital Hochstein for the book of Shemot. So thanks to everybody. I'm glad to see my parents on. Love to mom and dad. Good night to everybody.
Thank you. Yishkay.
Same to you.